High in the rugged Sonoran Desert resides the fascinating city of Nogales. Actually, it's two twin cities completely separated by the heavily fortified U.S.-Mexico border fence that stretches across the desert landscape like a monument to economic inequality. These neighboring communities share exactly the same harsh desert geography, with scorching summers exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, identical winter weather patterns, and largely identical cultural heritage deeply rooted in centuries-old Mexican traditions. Spanish is the primary language spoken fluently on both sides of the international border. Extended families often have relatives living just meters away across the heavily patrolled boundary, and the same dramatic mountain ranges frame both communities under the same southwestern sun that has witnessed centuries of human adaptation and struggle. Local festivals celebrating Mexican independence, traditional food cultures featuring authentic tacos and mole, mariachi music echoing through the streets at night, and deep Catholic religious traditions remain remarkably similar despite the stark political division that has separated these communities for over a century and a half. But this is precisely where the remarkable cultural and geographic similarities end abruptly, and the stark economic differences begin to reveal a much deeper and more troubling story about institutional quality, economic development, and human prosperity that has profoundly shaped the entire Western Hemisphere for over 5 centuries since European colonization began. To the north, just a few meters away in Nogales, Arizona, average household incomes are consistently over 7 times higher than their southern neighbors, providing families with access to economic opportunities and living standards that would be completely unimaginable just across the border fence. Most adults have successfully graduated from high school, and a significant percentage have gone on to pursue higher education at universities and community colleges throughout Arizona, California, and beyond, creating a skilled workforce capable of participating in the modern global economy. Life expectancy rates and overall healthcare quality are relatively high by international standards, and residents enjoy reliable, consistent access to all the basic public amenities and infrastructure that define modern civilization and enable economic development. These essential services include clean running water that flows consistently from household taps 24 hours a day without interruption, reliable electrical power that keeps homes and businesses functioning smoothly, well-maintained roads and highways that connect the community efficiently to larger economic centers like Phoenix and Tucson, effective police and fire departments that respond quickly and professionally to emergencies, functioning postal services that deliver mail reliably across the entire country, and public schools that provide quality education to all children regardless of their family's economic status or social background. Despite all the inefficiencies and bureaucratic problems that naturally plague any large democratic system, and the occasional corrupt politician that makes newspaper headlines and generates legitimate public outrage, the government that serves these Arizona citizens generally operates in accordance with fundamental constitutional principles and the population's democratic wishes expressed through regular, competitive elections that provide meaningful choices between different candidates and policy platforms. Citizens participate actively and meaningfully in regular elections for local, state, and federal offices, voice their concerns and policy preferences at town hall meetings and public forums, contact their elected representatives about important community issues through phone calls and letters, and generally expect their elected officials to be responsive to their needs, concerns, and long-term interests, rather than serving only wealthy donors or special interest groups that can provide campaign contributions. Most importantly, for economic development and long-term prosperity, residents of Nogales, Arizona do not live in constant, paralyzing fear that their investments, businesses, homes, or personal property will be arbitrarily confiscated by government officials seeking personal enrichment or political advantage over their constituents. They don't worry that corrupt bureaucrats will demand expensive bribes or under-the-table payments for basic government services like business permits, building licenses, or property titles. And they don't fear that their personal safety or their children's security is in serious jeopardy when they walk down the street during the day or evening, conduct normal business transactions with strangers, or send their children to school each morning, expecting them to return safely. To the south, in Nogales, Sonora, the economic and social picture is dramatically and heartbreakingly different, despite the identical geographic conditions, cultural background, and human potential that exists on both sides of the border. Despite having a population that is 12 times smaller than major American metropolitan areas like Detroit or Cleveland, this Mexican border town consistently records twice the number of violent homicides as St. Louis, Missouri, which held the unfortunate distinction of being the U.S. city with the highest murder rate in 2019, according to FBI crime statistics. Most adults living in Nogales, Sonora do not possess high school diplomas or equivalent educational credentials, which severely limits their employment opportunities, earning potential throughout their working lives, and ability to participate effectively in the modern global economy that increasingly demands skilled workers and technological literacy. The widespread lack of educational opportunities also significantly reduces residents' ability to start successful small businesses, access credit from financial institutions, navigate complex bureaucratic systems, adapt to technological changes, or participate meaningfully in democratic political processes that could potentially improve their community's dire economic and social conditions over time. Because of a chronic lack of sufficient healthcare infrastructure, adequately trained medical professionals, and modern medical equipment that meets basic international standards, expecting mothers must constantly worry about tragically high infant mortality rates that would be considered completely unacceptable and shocking just a few meters to the north across the border fence. Here at Economic Rewind, we've discovered through extensive research that this stark contrast highlights a much larger disparity affecting hundreds of millions of people. Latin American countries remain significantly poorer than northern counterparts, despite possessing superior natural resources, better agricultural conditions, and more favorable geographic positions. For most of recorded history, Latin America represented the hemisphere's most valuable real estate, both for sophisticated indigenous civilizations and European colonizers. The Aztecs, Incas, and Maya had established magnificent cities with advanced engineering and agricultural systems. Northern America was sparsely populated by nomadic tribes. Even in recent centuries, countries like Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, and Venezuela were expected to become global powers. By the 1950s, Venezuela experienced an unprecedented economic boom, becoming the world's third richest country per capita, after discovering it possessed the world's largest oil reserves, dwarfing those of the United States, Soviet Union, and Saudi Arabia. With World War II's end, oil demand skyrocketed, with automobile industry expansion and global trade growth. Venezuela's economy grew over 800% in 50 years, creating prosperity that seemed miraculous to international observers. But Venezuela is now an economic catastrophe, experiencing the largest economic downturn in modern history. Millions have fled their homeland, and hyperinflation made the currency worthless. This tragic pattern isn't unique. Most Latin American countries have failed to achieve their enormous potential since independence. To understand why Latin America's enormous natural advantages never translated into widespread prosperity for ordinary citizens, we must examine the colonial period and the specific institutional frameworks that European powers deliberately established to maximize wealth extraction. The story begins with ambitious Spanish expeditions that would forever alter the economic, political, and social trajectory of an entire continent. In 1516, Spanish navigator Juan Díaz de Solís sailed into a wide South American estuary, formally claimed the territory for the Spanish crown, and named the mighty river Rio de la Plata, River of Silver, in reference to the significant quantities of precious metals he discovered that local indigenous peoples possessed. The Charruas and Querandí peoples, both semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer societies, initially met these foreign invaders with fierce resistance. As a direct result of this sustained opposition, de Solís was killed shortly after arrival. Not discouraged by this setback, the Spanish crown quickly organized another expedition, led by Pedro de Mendoza, who founded Buenos Aires in 1534. Despite the favorable temperate climate, the settlement was soon abandoned because it lacked what the Spanish colonial system desperately needed: easily extractable precious metals and a large sedentary native population organized into hierarchical societies that could be systematically exploited. The colony sent expeditions seeking better conquest targets. Juan de Ayolas discovered the Guarani people, who, unlike nomadic tribes, were sedentary agriculturalists with established social hierarchies and ruling elites controlling agricultural surplus production. Spanish forces quickly overran the Guarani, founded Asunción, and implemented their preferred colonial strategy. The conquistadors strategically married into existing Guarani royal families and positioned themselves as new elites atop the already established social hierarchy. Rather than destroying existing institutions, they intelligently modified and adapted the systems already in place to demand tribute payments and force unpaid labor from the indigenous population. This successful approach reveals the fundamental Spanish colonization strategy that would be replicated throughout Latin America. Deliberately seek out indigenous peoples who had already established complex social hierarchies and sophisticated agricultural systems. forcibly insert Spanish elites at the top of these existing power structures, and utilize the established systems of exploitation for their own economic benefit. This pattern reached its devastating peak with Hernán Cortés's conquest of the Aztec Empire, beginning in 1519. When Emperor Montezuma welcomed Cortés into the magnificent capital city of Tenochtitlan, despite his advisors' warnings, he was immediately captured and used as a hostage to gain access to enormous treasures accumulated over generations. The Spanish systematically looted the accumulated wealth of one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations, melting down priceless Aztec artifacts, religious objects, and ceremonial items into crude gold and silver bars that could be easily transported back to Spain for the enrichment of conquistadors and the crown. By 1521, the entire mighty Aztec Empire had fallen to Spanish forces, and Cortés immediately began implementing the encomienda system, which granted individual conquistadors legal authority over specific numbers of indigenous people who were forced to provide unpaid labor and regular tribute payments. This system became the foundational institution for ruling and exploiting native populations throughout Spanish colonial territories. The encomienda was later supplemented by similar institutions like the hacienda system and various forms of debt peonage that continued to extract wealth from indigenous and mixed-race populations for centuries. The Spanish colonial strategy was remarkably consistent and devastatingly effective wherever large, organized indigenous populations could be found. The pattern was always the same. Locate societies with established hierarchies and agricultural surpluses, use superior military technology to defeat existing rulers, install Spanish elites at the top of existing social structures, and modify traditional institutions to channel wealth upward to colonial administrators and ultimately back to Spain. This extractive colonial model created enormous short-term wealth for Spanish colonial elites and the Spanish crown, but it also established institutional frameworks that were specifically designed to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a small ruling class, while systematically excluding the vast majority of the population from political participation and economic opportunity. The long-term consequences of this institutional design would prove catastrophic for Latin American development, creating patterns of inequality, political exclusion, and economic extraction that persist to this day throughout much of the region. Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the north, the English colonial experience in North America developed along completely different institutional lines that would have profound consequences for economic development. Not because the English were more enlightened or morally superior to the Spanish, but because the fundamental demographic and geographic conditions they encountered made the Spanish strategy of systematic exploitation impossible to implement effectively. The indigenous populations of North America were generally much smaller in total numbers than the massive civilizations of Central and South America, more geographically dispersed across vast territories, and largely organized into nomadic or semi-nomadic societies with relatively egalitarian social structures, making them extremely difficult to capture, control, and exploit through the hierarchical institutional frameworks that had proven so successful in Spanish territories. Additionally, these North American societies typically lacked the complex hierarchical social structures, centralized political authority, established systems of tribute collection, and large agricultural surpluses that had made Spanish conquest so profitable and manageable in regions like Mexico and Peru, where millions of people were already organized into tribute-paying systems. Faced with the impossibility of implementing extractive colonial institutions similar to those used in Spanish territories, English colonizers were forced to develop alternative approaches to making their colonial ventures economically viable and politically sustainable over the long term. The English colonial strategy evolved gradually, often through trial and error, toward creating positive incentives for European settlers to work hard, invest productively, and develop the land through their own labor rather than through exploitation of others. Rather than extracting wealth from existing populations, English colonies needed to create new wealth through the productive efforts of European immigrants. This fundamental difference in colonial strategy led to radically different institutional frameworks. English colonies gradually developed secure property rights, representative government, competitive markets, and individual economic opportunity that encouraged productive investment and innovation. When the Virginia Company initially tried to replicate European feudal systems and collective ownership in early Jamestown, colonists nearly starved because no individual had incentives to work hard when profits would be shared equally regardless of effort. Only when colonial administrators introduced private property rights and individual incentives did agricultural productivity increase dramatically and the colony become viable. The headright system granted land to individuals who paid passage to America, encouraging immigration and development while creating independent property owners with strong incentives to develop land productively and defend property rights through political participation. Colonial assemblies gave settlers meaningful political voice in decisions affecting taxation, land use, and trade policies, creating accountability mechanisms that prevented administrators from simply extracting wealth without providing services in return. Have you ever wondered how different your life might be if born just across a national border? These institutional frameworks help explain why arbitrary boundaries create dramatically different outcomes for people sharing culture and values. By the Revolutionary War, the 13 colonies had developed inclusive institutions, encouraging broad participation in economic and political life, protecting individual rights and property, and creating opportunities for social mobility based on effort rather than inherited status. The Constitution, with its checks and balances and protection of individual rights, further institutionalized these inclusive principles. Patent systems encouraged innovation by protecting inventors' rights to profit from creations. Banking developed competitively rather than being dominated by politically connected monopolies. Public education expanded to provide human capital development opportunities. These institutions created powerful incentives for productive behavior, working hard, investing wisely, innovating constantly, rather than rent-seeking through political connections or exploitation of others. The contrast with Spanish colonial institutions could not have been more stark or consequential. While the United States declared independence from Britain as the result of broad-based political movements that had gradually distributed power among growing numbers of citizens demanding representation, Latin American independence movements developed along drastically different lines, with profound consequences for long-term development. By the early 19th century, the exploitative colonial institutions established by Spanish conquistadors centuries earlier still existed throughout Latin America, either in original forms or modified versions adapted to serve elite interests. Conquistadors' descendants maintained privileged positions atop rigid social hierarchies, continuing to exploit the vast majority who remained excluded from political participation. Spanish colonial elites were generally content with continued Spanish rule because it protected their privileged status and guaranteed continued access to wealth and power. Exploited indigenous and mixed-race populations, comprising the vast majority, lacked institutional mechanisms to challenge existing power structures or improve their circumstances. However, in 1808, Napoleon's forces invaded and occupied Spain, creating a political crisis with unexpected consequences throughout the Spanish Empire. The monarchy was overthrown, and a liberal resistance government created a new constitution, dramatically limiting colonial elites' traditional powers to subjugate New World populations. Out of fear of losing their political and economic stranglehold, and recognizing Spanish weakness, Latin American elites began declaring independence one by one, explicitly to maintain existing control without liberal interference from Spanish reformers, who might have implemented more inclusive institutions. Instead of creating stronger, more democratic systems as a result of independence, many Latin American governments became even more tyrannical toward the general population than under Spanish rule. They inherited extractive frameworks, concentrating power in small elite groups without developing inclusive institutions providing peaceful change mechanisms. Under these circumstances, the only way new groups could gain power was through violent revolution or military coups. This caused post-independence Latin America to be defined by chronic political instability, widespread corruption, and successive military dictators. Mexico perfectly exemplifies this pattern. Between 1824 and 1867, there were 52 different Mexican presidents, most rising to power through military force rather than constitutional processes. This extreme instability led to highly insecure property rights and a weak state with little control over large portions of the country. Without strong government, political stability, or secure property rights, the Mexican economy suffered tremendously during this crucial period of global development. Entrepreneurs couldn't get patents, create substantial businesses due to monopolies awarded to political allies, or obtain loans since banking remained uncompetitive. While the United States experienced a financial revolution, growing from 338 banks in 1818 to 27,864 by 1914, Mexico, by 1910, had only 42 banks, with just 2 controlling 60% of the entire market. This lack of competition meant extremely high interest rates, making loans useful only to wealthy elites who used capital to further monopolize markets rather than fund productive investments benefiting society. But what prevented U.S. bankers from implementing similar monopolistic strategies? The incentive certainly existed, and some early politicians attempted creating monopolies for personal profit. However, unlike Latin America, these politicians faced regular, fair elections. Since banking monopolies hurt ordinary citizens, voters consistently elected candidates promising to dismantle monopolistic practices. Here at Economic Rewind, we've observed how democratic accountability creates powerful incentives for politicians to serve public rather than just elite interests. The differences became more pronounced when frontier lands opened through railroad construction. While the U.S. incentivized ordinary citizens to cultivate lands through free homesteads, Latin American lands were expropriated by existing elites. With Industrial Revolution trade expansion, resource-rich countries realized enormous profits from frontier resources. However, in Latin America, established elites captured these profits rather than ordinary citizens benefiting from national wealth. This institutional framework perfectly explains Venezuela's tragic transformation from world-class economic performer to humanitarian crisis. Instead of developing broad-based political systems and competitive markets that could efficiently utilize enormous oil wealth for all citizens' benefit, Venezuela fell victim to the classic resource curse, where abundant natural resources actually harm long-term economic development. Oil abundance led to an overvalued currency that made other domestic economic sectors uncompetitive in international markets, while simultaneously enabling massive government spending programs and corruption that eventually led to hyperinflation and complete economic collapse when global oil prices declined and revealed underlying institutional weaknesses. This same devastating pattern has occurred throughout Latin America, with temporary wealth from sugar, tobacco, precious metals, lumber, emeralds, cattle, and other natural resources. In each case, significant wealth and income growth benefited only small groups of politically connected elites, rather than the broader population, who continued struggling with poverty, limited educational opportunities, and lack of economic mobility. Democracy has come late, slowly, and remains largely unfulfilled throughout most of Latin America. Politicians to this day often remain corrupt and unaccountable to their citizens, and as a direct result, economic institutions continue to be designed primarily to benefit those who possess political power rather than to promote broad-based economic growth and opportunity for all citizens. Nogales, Arizona is dramatically richer and more prosperous than Nogales, Sonora, specifically because of the fundamentally different political and economic institutions that govern their respective nations. In the United States, you can relatively easily start a business, purchase a home, or make long-term investments while feeling confident that the government will uphold your legal rights to your property and protect your economic interests from arbitrary seizure. This confidence exists not because American politicians are necessarily looking out for citizens' best interests out of pure altruism, but because these politicians understand that they are ultimately accountable to voters who can remove them from office through regular elections if they fail to protect citizens' rights and promote economic opportunity. Any systematic attempt to undermine citizens' access to political participation or economic institutions is typically met with organized opposition that leads to the election of candidates with more popular policy positions that better serve the general public interest. In contrast, Latin American governments continue to be haunted by the institutional ghosts of colonial systems that were originally designed to extract wealth from and exploit the common people, rather than to promote their prosperity and development. The political instability that has historically coincided with these extractive institutions has also meant that central governments couldn't become sufficiently powerful to enforce consistent law and order throughout their territories. For average Latin Americans, it remains significantly more difficult to build successful businesses, riskier to make long-term investments, and more challenging to accumulate wealth through honest work and innovation. Because of the lack of genuine market competition that results from rampant political favoritism and monopolistic practices, productivity growth has remained stagnant, which means that real incomes have stagnated as well. Do you think this institutional pattern sounds familiar in your own country? Have you observed examples where political connections and corruption seem more important than merit, hard work, or innovation for achieving economic success and social mobility? Latin America was colonized on the fundamental basis of exploiting existing populations to extract wealth for European colonial powers and local elites. While this extractive strategy proved completely infeasible in North America due to different demographic conditions that forced the development of more inclusive institutions. The persistent differences in economic prosperity between these regions are not due to geography, culture, natural resources, or even differences between British and Spanish colonial empires, but rather result from the complex interaction of indigenous population distributions in the New World, the evolution of specific historical events during the colonial and independence periods, and the resulting differences in institutional incentive structures that developed as a consequence and have persisted for centuries. The tragedy of Latin America is not a lack of potential. The region possesses abundant natural resources, favorable climates, strategic geographic locations, and talented populations with rich cultural traditions and strong work ethics. The real tragedy is that institutions inherited from the colonial period continue preventing this enormous potential from being realized for the benefit of ordinary citizens, rather than just privileged elites who use political power to maintain their advantages. Understanding this historical pattern reveals that sustainable economic development is not primarily about having the right natural resources or favorable geographic advantages, but about creating and maintaining institutional frameworks that provide incentives for productive behavior, protect individual rights, encourage innovation and entrepreneurship, and ensure that the benefits of economic growth are shared broadly throughout society rather than captured by small elite groups. The story of Nogales demonstrates that just a few meters of distance across a political border can mean the difference between prosperity and poverty, not because of any inherent differences between the people on either side, but because of the institutions that govern their economic and political lives and shape their opportunities for advancement. If you found this analysis of Latin American economic development fascinating, make sure to subscribe to Economic Rewind and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our future deep dives into economic history and institutional analysis. What other regions or historical periods would you like us to examine next? Let me know in the comments below. I read every suggestion, and your input helps shape our future content.